symbol. It is the working seat of government where people of all races and all conditions bring the anxieties, the hopes, the aspirations all of us share for our country, for ourselves, and for our children, making this a living memorial to our constant dream of a government that truly is of the people, by the people, and for the people of this land. For the next few minutes, we will be looking closely at the historic Congress and Congress as it works today. To help us, we've called on Congressman Mark Andrews, a Republican from the High Plains state of North Dakota, and Senator Thomas Eagleton, a Democrat from Missouri. For special comment, we turn to Hubert Humphrey. Mr. Humphrey's entire life has been spent as a student, teacher, and practitioner of the political science.
The key, the well-known secret of our success of government as a system is called checks and balances, and checks and balances that really work. The men who gathered at Philadelphia to write our Constitution had an unusual degree of foresight, much of it born out of experience. They were, in a sense, students of government, but they were also practitioners of government. Many of them had served in colonial assemblies, in the House of Burgess, for example, in Virginia. And while they were Englishmen and proud of English traditions, from the Magna Carta to the House of Parliament and the rights of the people under common law, they began to develop a whole new breed of man. People wanted to govern themselves. This was a new country. It had different problems than the mother country. It was open. It was virgin territory. And English domination seemed out of place. What they really wanted, above all, was autonomy. That's where they started. But like many revolutions, it has its own lifeline. You start with one thing and it progresses to another, full independence. And they set themselves to that task and produced a system of government known as separation of powers and checks and balances.
So there came into being in Philadelphia in 1780 a government with three branches, each capable of checking the power of the other two. The first article was designed to create an instrument that would limit the powers that could be exercised by any one man. That instrument would be known as the Congress of the United States, and all legislative matters would be vested in it. Then came Article 2, which created the office of Chief Executive. He would administer the laws. Then the Constitution makers went one step further. To safeguard those inalienable rights granted to the people, the third article was written, creating a federal judiciary headed by a Supreme Court of the United States.
The workings of our checks and balances system probably never was more dramatically illustrated than in the case of the Great Depression, when Franklin D. the battle over the NRA, the court fight and the court rejection of Roosevelt. Then President Roosevelt's attack on the Supreme Court. And finally, congressional rejection of the Roosevelt solution to the problem of the court.
The vesting of all legislative power in two houses of Congress instead of one was a result of compromise. When the Constitution was under debate, the larger states favored election of all members to be based strictly on population. Smaller states insisted on equal representation for every state, a deadlock. Then Connecticut proposed a resolution. There should be two houses. One would be composed of 2 senators from every state. In this way, the individual's rights, no matter where he lived, would be balanced off against the power of the state. The second house, the House of Representatives, would be made up of members elected on the basis of population, with every state, no matter how small it might be, entitled to at least 1 member. The size of representation has grown through the years, but the form has stayed the same. Throughout most of our history, 2 political parties have contended for political power in America, and power is divided between them. This division serves as still another check, this one outside the Constitution, on unlimited power by any one group or whichever party has elected the most members controls the machinery. In both houses, there is a majority leader and an assistant leader who is known frequently as the whip. There is a minority leader whose assistant is known as the minority whip. The majority party in the House elects the Speaker. The Vice President of the United States presides over the Senate. This is a simplified version of how our Congress is organized. The actual workings are far more complicated and elaborate. For example, 3 large buildings, each a block square in size, are required to serve members of the House of Representatives, their staffs, their committee operations. Members are elected to serve 2 years. Then they must return to their districts to seek approval to return again. The 50 states are divided into 435 congressional districts with an average population in each of 470,000 people.
Mark Andrews of North Dakota.
For a congressman like Mark Andrews, who serves the state of North Dakota with a population of 618,000, the hours are long, the work challenging and varied. He relies heavily on a trained and dedicated staff.
When he's here, and if he can't make heads roll in that department, then we'll see why not. And in this letter from this young boy out at Minot who requests an Army reassignment, it seems to be a reasonable request. Why don't you see if the Army can go along with it? And if they can't, get us a good reason why not. This casework, I know it takes a lot of time, but as the government bureaucracy get all the time, even if we've got to work some late hours sometime, I think we've got to be the intermediary between the people and the bureaucracy. What about Mr. and Mrs. Hanson from Kindred? Aren't they?
Across Capitol Plaza to the north, 2 other block square buildings house this country's 100 senators, their staffs, their committee and hearing rooms. Senators are elected to 6-year terms, and the longer they stay here, the more powerful they become.
You had one. Let me go back here. Yes, sir.
As a senator, what do you think needs to be done to reform some of the procedures in Congress, especially like the seniority system?
Members of the Senate, as well as of the House, find claim constituent needs. One unofficial but important role they
On the seniority system is what do you substitute in lieu thereof? But I think it's too narrow just to say he who's been here the longest, be he 80 or 90, and we've had some committee chairmen in their 90s, that they can serve as effectively and as vigorously as someone of more tender years might serve.
Do you feel that in the Senate you should vote exactly as your constituents ask you to, or should you vote
exactly? First, of course, you're supposed to vote your conscience. Most of you ask any senator, he'll say, I vote my conscience. Who's going to make a public admission that he doesn't? Certain areas, you vote what you know to be the prevalent opinion of your constituents, even though you may have some lingering doubts about it. I at one time held some positions on gun control that were very antagonistic to the prevalent thought of my constituents. I've since switched my position on that because my constituents are so overwhelmingly opposed to it on an issue that I don't consider to be paramount. I'll have to weigh my constituents' judgment on that fact. Yes.
Senators welcome the chance to talk openly and candidly with young constituents like these. They're able to explain the many roles a congressman must play. What are these roles? How does he serve the people who elect him? He is first of all a maker of laws.
Part of a congressman's job is legislative. He has to introduce legislation. He has to sit on committees where legislation is discussed. He has to draw up the spending bills and the taxing bills of this country. And that's part of his job.
Though Congress is the legally constituted lawmaking branch of our government, it has become traditional for every chief executive to propose legislative programs that he wants to see enacted.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet...
But no matter how meaningful or dramatic a presidential proposal may be, that proposal will go nowhere if Congress does not approve. So while President Kennedy could lay the blueprint for putting a man on the moon in the 60s, it was Congress who passed the laws and provided the funds to make this great venture possible. Most of the real work of Congress is not conducted on the floors of the Senate and the House, but in committees. And it is in committees that our elected representatives can be most effective.
After you get the bill in the hopper, it's referred to a committee almost immediately. And the committee chairman, if the author of the bill requests it, will request departmental reports. This is when if it's an Interior bill, the Department of Interior will give its opinion of the bill and how it would function and whether they are for it or against it. This takes care of the administration side. Then the committee, if it feels the bill is of significant importance, will begin to hold hearings. The publicity given to the hearing process when individuals come in on both sides of this legislation is where the people become aware of what this legislation could do, and they then have the opportunity to contact their members of Congress, to contact people in the associations they belong to come down and make their views known.
No area of government commands more public suspicion than the activities of those who represent special interest groups or companies. They are called lobbyists.
I presume that, by and large, the public has a very negative judgment as to what a lobbyist is. In fact, the word lobbyist or lobbying in many circles is deemed to be a dirty word. I don't so deem it. A lobbyist can be very helpful to a senator in terms of gathering information and statistics and relevant information that otherwise he and his staff would maybe have to take hundreds of hours to bring in. Where lobbying gets to be a dirty word is where a lobbyist has used undue pressure or attempted to intimidate a member of the Senate or a member of the House. Then lobbying of that type is negative, is corrupt, and is sinister.
Every bill of any importance whatsoever requires a battery of witnesses, administrative officials, advocates of the measure, opponents, experts, ordinary citizens whose lives will be touched by the measure. Hearings must be outside of Washington. All this takes time.
It might take 2 or 3 Congresses before the hearings are finally wound up and a bill becomes presentable to be brought to the floor of the House or the Senate. And then when it passes one body, it goes through the hearing process in the other body.
And if there are differences between the House version of a bill and the Senate version of the bill, those differences have to be reconciled because a bill has to be passed in identical form by both houses before it goes to the President for his signature. If there are differing versions, then there's what's called a conference committee between the House and the Senate, so that there is this one unified version that goes to the President for his signature. The President then signs the bill, or he can veto it. If he vetoes it, his veto can be overridden if 2/3 of both the Senate and the House vote to override. That's very difficult and very rare that a presidential veto is overridden.
Much of the committee work is investigative. The chairman of a congressional subcommittee calls witnesses who can shed light on problems which may...
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Senate Committee on the District of Columbia is now in session to continue its hearings into the...
Some committee work is seemingly mundane, not of overwhelming national importance, but it must be done for every piece of legislation. There have been committee hearings of real national interest, and the coming of television in the late 1940s began bringing those investigations into the nation's living rooms.
New York City holds the stage as its federal court building is the setting for final hearings outside of Washington by Senate crime investigators. The probe of crime and its alleged connection with politics and public officials was scheduled to bring 50 witnesses, including former Mayor William O'Dwyer, before Committee Chairman Estes Kefauver and fellow Senators Charles W. Tobey and Herbert R. O'Connor. O'Dwyer and committee member Tobey clashed verbally over the death of Abe Rellis, O'Dwyer's star witness in a murder case involving mobster Albert Anastasia.
We're talking about the death of Abe Rellis. Mr. Balls had one theory, you have another, I have another, and somebody else has another. Now the complete investigation can be made.
I'm prepared to talk about the facts in the case. You're prepared, and you are talking about some dream that you have in your mind, Senator. Some innuendo.
No, this don't. A little child could understand this, and I say again, you said that no statute of limitations runs against a murder case.
Yes.
That's the law. But I said, and I asked your assent to it as a man, but a disappearance of witnesses nullifying as a statute of limitations, isn't it?
What you're saying is that if you don't have witnesses, you can't prosecute or get a conviction.
You
You're
can't
right.
put words in my mouth. The English language is plain. The sentence is fair. I asked you a question, yes or no?
I will agree that if there are no witnesses, you can't prosecute.
Television has familiarized us with congressional committee hearings, but our closest contact with our representatives or senators comes when we have problems.
The average individual calls because he's concerned about a pension that he should have gotten. He's concerned about the way they're interpreting a feed grains program.
Or my Social Security check didn't arrive this month. Or I'd like to get a passport because I've got to make an emergency business trip to Europe. dozens, indeed hundreds of casework type situations where individuals are having difficulty getting through the bureaucracy and the labyrinth of the federal government. The senator is the ombudsman for those individuals and helps move it along through this labyrinth and through this confusing thing called the federal bureaucracy.
A member of Congress also serves as ambassador from the people who elect him. He is expected to report back to his constituents about what he's observed and what action he has taken on their behalf.
This country of ours is based on the concept of individual participation in government. This is our government, as long as we participate in it. And the members of Congress, both political parties, have a pretty serious duty to report back to people what's going on, so they'll know what their government is doing to and for them. And this sometimes is as being, oh well, just so much politics or showmanship. But the report to the people, the concept that in early days meant that Congress only met from March until May, and the rest of the time they lived among the people they represented and were of the people. This concept has got to be strengthened in our government. The congressman should spend more time in his own district, more time where he's available to rub elbows with the people whose votes he cast.
But before a man can cast his vote for the people he represents, he must first get elected.
The senator is a politician, that is, by his constituents, and presumably wants to be reelected. I know I do. So he wants to create a favorable image with his constituents and do the right thing politically.
Today, it's commonplace to have candidates of all persuasions take to the hustings, taking their campaigns to the people. They charter helicopters and trains, employ advertising agencies, look for the gimmick that will work, and they walk the length and breadth of the entire states. Occasionally, the electorate makes mistakes. All of us know of scoundrels who've ended up in Congress. Some of them later ended up in jail. But by and large, high standards of integrity are maintained by the great majority who serve in our national legislative body, and most are motivated far beyond their personal or party interests.
If we had party lines and we did nothing but fight on the basis of raw partisan politics, we couldn't. And I think we're fortunate in this nation that this is not the way that the situation exists.
So, members of both houses of Congress share certain qualities. They are legislators, they're committee members, they're investigators, caseworkers, communicators, politicians. But certain prerogatives and responsibilities also make each house unique and set each one apart from the other.
The United States Senate, it's unique in the sense that it's the legislative branch that has to do with treaties. You'll recall the most famous treaty debate, I guess, in the history of this country was Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations.
That treaty grew out of the United States' first major involvement in a land war across the Atlantic, when we sent American soldiers to fight in World War I, and President Woodrow Wilson took an active hand in drafting the terms for peace.
He went over to France, negotiated the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles, etc. It was taken to the United States Senate and was defeated. The Senate is also the single body of the legislative branch that has to do with the confirmation of presidential appointees.
The Senate has never hesitated to assert this control. It started with the first president, when George Washington's nomination of John Rutledge to be Chief Justice was turned down. When Andrew Jackson named Roger Taney to be Secretary of the Treasury, the Senate said no. The Senate rejected Calvin Coolidge's choice of Charles B. Warren to be Attorney General, and Dwight Eisenhower's naming of Louis Strauss to be Secretary of Commerce. Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon also suffered a series of rejections of judicial appointments.
Then the Senate is different than, I guess, any other legislative body on the globe in that it has the right of unlimited debate, called by those who don't like that rule a filibuster. We've had many filibusters in Senate through the years on civil rights matters, ST, the supersonic transport, on the ABM. The only body that has a rule of unlimited debate where it takes 2/3 of the members of that body to vote to close off debate.
The House has been the initiator of all revenue bills and the initiator of all spending bills. So our Ways and Means Committee puts together the taxing bills. Our Appropriations Committee puts together, in fact, writes all appropriations bills, all spending bills. All the Senate does is take a look at the bills we author and the men. They might add a little or they might subtract a little. But the basic work is done here. And I think it's done not only because of precedent and constitutionality, but because in the House, with 435 members, you become specialists. In the Senate, they're largely generalists. We have to know the field we're in.
A congressman is summoned to the floor. Final debate is scheduled on a bill that has been months in preparation. And here at last, exercising judgment, conscience, and his best knowledge of his constituents' interests, he'll cast his vote. These are just two of 535 voting members we've elected to the two houses of Congress. They're symbolic of all their colleagues. They're a symbol of much more. They're symbols of a rich tradition and heritage passed down to them across the years, of giants who preceded them in Congress. Of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, whose debate on the Senate floor spelled out the dilemma over slavery this nation faced, and which is said by many to have postponed the Civil War for 10 years. John C. Calhoun also tried to save the Union. But representing the views of his fellow Southerners, he fought strenuously against the Clay-Webster compromise, saying, compromise would eventually destroy the Union. Men like John Quincy Adams, who, having served his country as ambassador to England, Secretary of State, President of the United States wanting to serve, came to Congress as a member of the House to represent his friends and neighbors in Quincy, Massachusetts. He served in the House for 17 years, being stricken while on the floor and dying in his 81st year. Like these who have made the Congress of the United States in this last third of the 20th century, an institution uniquely tailored for free self, a system unlike that we brought from England or other lands across the seas. A legislative body was different.
Here was the difference. Not the difference of constitution, not the difference even of law, but the difference of the social and political inheritance, the heritage of a nation and of a people, actually, in a sense, determined the course that these men were to follow. But the Congress, in the end, is more than an institution. The Congress is more than just one instrument of government. The Congress, in essence, at any given moment, is the people.